Well, I feel like we should start tonight by asking the question, what does it mean not to enter into God's rest? As we come into some sort of a conclusion about this study, what does it mean not to enter God's rest? And we need to ask that probably first in the Old Testament examples. So we eventually want to get the answer in that setting, in that context, so that when we get that answer, we can bring it into our context. What does it mean for us as New Testament believers if we don't enter into God's rest? These are big theological debates that people have, if you don't know, especially out of the book of Hebrews. There's some warning passages all throughout the book, and big debates as to what it means. Does it mean this? Does it mean that? A lot of people, and smarter than me, have different opinions, even with each other. So that's the question we're going to open with. And again, the idea is to practically bring it into our context, whatever that answer might be. So let's ask the question for the wilderness generation. What did it mean for the wilderness generation not to enter into God's rest? And let's follow that up with another question that I think would help focus narrow our focus a little bit. Did their inability to act in faith, that wilderness generation, did their inability to act in faith, and coupled with God's anger, right, over their inability to act in faith, did that sever the relationship between God and the people? It did prevent them from entering his rest. And the picture of his rest, remember, in the Old Testament is the promised land. So it did prevent them from entering into the rest, but did it sever their relationship? And some people would say yes, I think it may have. And they would take you to several places where God showed his anger and brought plagues upon them and different things throughout that story, which those are all there. But I'd like to point out the fact that every day when they got up, for the 40 years, that manna was still there, right? The picture of his faithfulness, a picture of who he is, his character, and invited them to leave their tents and go out in faith, I would say, if not every day in faith, at least on that sixth day, because there was one guy that collected too much and then it went bad, and I think they probably got into a rhythm of trusting him on the sixth day, right? So even though they're talked about as a terribly unfaithful group, where over and over again they chose not to respond in faith, we do have that picture. God was guiding them with a pillar of fire by night and a cloud by day. Throughout the 40 years, he was guiding them. He was in their presence. He was camped in the middle of their camp. And so that was the picture that God chose. He described how they should be camped around him, the tabernacle, the sign of his presence. So I don't know that I'm ready to say that their inability to respond in faith, and even God's anger against them for that, severed their relationship. But I am willing to say that it changed their relationship, right? So when these people failed to enter the promised land, they missed out on what? They missed out on a restful opportunity. And again, I'm just going to say it at the beginning, I'm not talking about laziness and lying in a hammock rest, right? What I'm saying is they missed out on the opportunity to go into a land and live at peace with God, following his rules and seeing him as the leader, their ruler, right? That's what they missed out on. They missed out on an existence of working unhindered in cooperation with God on a daily basis in the promised land. Think about the difference it would have been had they gone into the land originally. The way it's described, there are cities there that you haven't built. There are vineyards that other people have planted that you will just move in and you'll reap. What's this a picture of? A city that you don't have to build? Vineyards that are already planted? It's a small picture of Eden, right? We're going way back to the garden where God provided for Adam and Eve, right? They didn't have to plant the vineyards. They just went and harvested. So they missed out. That wilderness generation, they missed out on being where they were supposed to be and doing what they were created to do. And instead, their relationship with God was qualitatively different. But I would argue it was still a relationship. Right? So if that's the Old Testament picture, the other question that everybody asks is, and I put it in the lesson, right? Big debate. Are we going to see these people in heaven? Right? And there are people all over the place, answers on this. So a lot of people feel like, no, they missed out, there's no way. I think that ultimately it's not for me to decide. How about that? Is that fair? Okay. But with that said, and you kind of have to always say that, right, as a precursor, because if you don't, then you really think that you're deciding, and that's not good. But I think the text may give us some clues, and I think if the text gives us some clues, we're probably supposed to kind of realize what those clues are and maybe come to some sort of a conclusion, at least halfway. So the text presents that generation, and Moses as their leader, by the way, are examples of both faith and unbelief. And we did that in the book of Hebrews specifically. If you go to where we've been in Hebrews 3 and 4, this wilderness generation and Moses and Aaron are all held up as people at Meribah and Massah that acted in complete unbelief. Okay, that's stated outright. It's stated they always go astray in their hearts. Okay, they tested me. The passage regarding Moses in Numbers 20 specifically says, you did not believe, which seems pretty harsh. I think I'm going to see Moses in heaven, right? I mean, nobody wants to send Moses to hell. Is that? And I don't think we have to, because there's another New Testament, the Transfiguration, right? The Transfiguration, Jesus goes up on a mountain. Jesus, whose real name is Joshua, right? Goes up on a mountain, and who's he meet up there? Oh, Moses is up there, and they have a little powwow with Elijah, okay? And they're talking about the Exodus ministry that Jesus is performing in his incarnation. So I think Moses did make it into the promised land, right? Literally, I mean, at the Transfiguration, even though he was prevented from entering with his people during his lifetime. So they're examples of unbelief in Hebrews 3 and 4, but then we took you to Hebrews 11. And Hebrews 11 is this big faith chapter, right? And so when we got there, we noticed that Moses takes up a larger portion than any other character. And in fact, it's Moses that he continues to go through the story of who Moses was and what he did and repeat all these examples of what great faith they have. And I don't know if you noticed there down at the end, in verse 29, it lumps Moses and Aaron in with the wilderness generation that came out of Egypt. And it says, by faith they passed through the Red Sea as though they were passing through on dry land. So, coming out of just this Hebrews example, are we going to see them in heaven? Well, what I see in the Hebrews, these two places in Hebrews, is these people are lifted up as examples of great faith and great unbelief, which almost seems weird. But what comes first? Hebrews 3 and 4 comes before Hebrews 11. So the author of Hebrews, whoever that was, wrote about the great unbelief of this group of people first. And then several chapters later, as he's including the larger story of all the people of faith out of the Old Testament, decides to grab that group that he had just lambasted, right? And bring them into this chapter of faith and lift them up as great people of faith. So it sounds a bit like me. And I think it sounds a bit like other people who are people of faith. We have moments of great faith, don't we? We have moments of great faith. Where our decisions to trust God allows us to exit our normal life and enter into an unhindered relationship with God. Moments of the great faith. They may be short-lived. And if they don't last that long, what's right around the corner? What's been the typical for humanity? Humanity is moments of varying levels of unbelief. And that's what we see with this wilderness generation. When we respond in unbelief, it pulls us out of that restful position we are in with God, where we're under His authority, and we're in our place doing our thing. And it pulls us out of that. It pulls us out of the garden, and we begin to work on our own. And I think they're all mixed together. And I think that's the example we have out of the Old Testament from these people. I like to talk about faith in terms of a dimmer switch. Have I talked about this? Dimmer switches. You guys know dimmer switches. They have two functions, and they have several different styles, but one that we have at our house, there's a toggle switch on the bottom of the switch. Okay, what's that toggle switch do? Toggle switch turns it on or off, right? The other feature is a dimmer switch. It's the little slider. Those are fun, right? Those are the ones you tell your kids to stop playing with, right? So the thing is, if the toggle switch is off, it doesn't matter what you do with the dimmer switch, right? But when you flip on the toggle switch, the power is to the dimmer, and then you can regulate the power great or little. I like to think of our faith that way. I like to think of our faith being toggled on or off. You either have it or you don't. And we can back this up if we had more time. We can back this up biblically, person of faith or not. But here in the story of Moses, especially, when Moses, late in his life, may have been following God for years and years, faithfully, as a great example, as we see in chapter 11. And he messes up at one time, and he's described as a man in unbelief, because you did not believe me. You did not trust me to show me as faithful to the people of Israel. And what I like to think is this, because other places in the Bible, it talks about faith in terms of quantity, right? If you only had a little faith, like a mustard seed, right? Well, what is a little faith? I mean, think about it just practically. What's a little faith? Or sometimes Jesus meets people outside the nation of Israel, and he's surprised. Well, I don't know if he's surprised. I think he probably knows it's coming. But he's maybe surprised at the variance between the lack of a response of faith in the people of Israel and these people outside of Israel. And he says, "Oh, you have great faith." And so what I like to think is that the way the Bible presents faith is not just an on or off switch, because that's sometimes how we present it. I was listening to a podcast this afternoon of a guy that I really admire, his opinion, and he was talking about Hebrews 3 and 4, because I wanted to get his opinion, and he was talking about it just in terms of toggle switch, on or off. If you have faith, you have it, but if you don't have faith, you don't. And in one sense, that's true. But in another sense, I'd like to think that the description of Moses, when he's described as a man that acted in unbelief, I don't think I'm ready to say that that's just, he's completely void of faith. We know that he ends up in, at least on the Mount of Transfiguration, I'll give him that, right? If not in very heaven itself. So what I like to think of it is, are you a person with the toggle switch on or off? And if it's off, what's the main thing? Stop playing with the dimmer switch, because it's not doing anything. Let's get that toggle switch on. Let's present the message of Christ so that the toggle switch comes on. And then, what can we expect through life? We can expect times of great faith where that toggle switch is up and the lights are bright and we're seeing things clearly, right? About how God works in our life. But then right around the corner, that dimmer switch might come down, and it's not that we're devoid of faith. If you take that dimmer switch all the way down, it looks like there's no light. Looks like there's no power going to the light, right? But the toggle switch can be on, and your dimmer switch can be going up and down. And I think that's the idea of faith that we see in the Bible. I think that's what we have. So as we come out of this Old Testament example, What does it mean to not live or not enter into rest? For them, I believe it was a qualitatively different relationship with God, but it was still a relationship. Instead of enjoying the land and probably the freedom that the land offered them, they were confined in the wilderness. They had to gather the type of food that God provided for them over and over again instead of having more of a bounty, okay? And I think that's the picture that we have coming out of this. So I took you lastly to Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. So if Moses and the Israelites are the examples to us of what to do in some circumstances of faith and what not to do in some circumstances where they don't have faith, who is it that's the perfect example of faith? Okay, who is that? Who is it that lived a life of faith at all times? Didn't ever slip into unbelief in any capacity on a dimmer switch. He remained at rest with the Father without failing. Who is that? Well, it's right after that faith chapter, the very next chapter. Therefore, we have this great cloud of witnesses. We've got all these people that we just talked about in the last chapter. But if we fix verse 2, our eyes on Jesus, Jesus is the author and perfecter of faith. And there are some English versions that have decided to put your faith or our faith in there. He's the perfecter of our faith, but it's not there in the original. So this is actually a closer rendition of it. Jesus is the author and perfecter of faith. When he lived here on earth, he perfected faith. He is the example of not a sliding scale like Moses and the people, right, and everybody else in the Old Testament that was listed in the last chapter. He is the perfecter of faith. And it's when we adopt his example of faith that we too will be able to live fully at rest with God.